All right, it is time to begin on this nice rainy day. The arc should be finished by the end of class tonight. Um, in all seriousness, though, I do come with a bit of a heavy heart. I'm sometimes asked by Dean, what's the happenings in Emery County? And I have an answer to that question tonight. On sometime Monday, the dad of one of Eddie's classmates in preschool took his own life, only 24 years old. And it was not only the dad of Eddie's classmate, but it was also the son of the custodian at the building where Desiree works. And so Desiree told me about, I first heard that the son had committed suicide, and I'm like, okay. But then Desiree showed me a picture of the son, and that's when it all kind of hit me. I'm like, I know that guy, I've met him. So my song selection tonight kind of revolves around the fact that when we get to heaven, we won't have to deal with stuff like this any longer. So if you'll open with me to 882. Anyway, the guy's name was Chance, and Oldroyd, I think is how you pronounce his last name, so if you'll just keep that family in your prayers. But 882, we'll sing all three. No tears in heaven, no sorrows given, all will be glory in that land. There'll be no sadness, all will be gladness, when we shall join that happy band. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known. Glory is waiting up yonder, where we shall spend an endless day. There with our Savior we'll be forever, where no more sorrow can dismay. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known. Some morning yonder we'll cease to ponder o'er things this life has brought to view. All will be clearer, saved ones be dearer, in heaven where all will be made new. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known. All right, our next song will be 490. And after this, if Matt, you'll lead us in our opening prayer. That's 490. So it's another song that there in that first line, as we see, says, when sorrows like sea billows roll, they're still well with our soul. And so it's part of the reason I chose this song for tonight. But we'll sing all three on this one, and then Matt will have our opening prayer. Excuse me, I lost the tune. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul, with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul, with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when the face shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul, with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul.
Dear God, our Father in heaven, we're thankful for another wonderful day in our lives. We are thankful for this time and opportunity to come here and study your word. Be with us as we do this, and may we open our hearts and minds and learn the things that Dave presents to us tonight and remember them. And Father, at this time we ask that somehow you bring peace and comfort to the Oldroyd family and their loss. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Well, I've said this before when Maria and Jeannie passed away, but I'm going to say it again with what's happened in Emery County. It's one of those things that, even though those tragedies happen, life must go on. And so that's what we're going to do tonight, is just continue on in our study of Luke in Luke chapter 2. So if you'll open with me to that chapter, that's Luke chapter 2. Now here in this chapter, we are looking at the birth story of Jesus as well as some of his early childhood. Now, verses 1 through 38, we've already looked at. That was the birth story. That was where we saw Jesus as a baby. And verses 39 and 40 is the return to Nazareth, where Luke recorded very briefly some words about the growth and development of the child Jesus, is how he's referred to in those verses. And it's in that context that as we arrive at verse 41 of this chapter, Luke again moves forward in time. And he says there, "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover." Now, what's happening here in verse 41? What are we told? They're going to Jerusalem for the Passover feast, and how often did they do that? Every year. Every year, this is something they did since Jesus was a baby and probably even before. They traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that what Luke records Jesus' parents as doing is something that was required of them by Jewish law. And we find that in passages such as Exodus 23, verses 14 through 17, and Deuteronomy 16, verse 16. Now, those passages indicate that more specifically, it was male Jews who were especially required to attend the feast of the Passover. Women, they were not obligated. They could attend, but they weren't obligated to attend as the males were. But even so, Mary and Joseph, they went together. And so what Luke records here is another statement about how what we're calling the earthly parents of Jesus, Joseph and Mary, they're again with their son, Jesus, are carrying out their faithfulness to God and his laws, along with how we are now going to refer to as the boy, Jesus. Anything else in verse 41? All right. So verse 41 is another one of those stage-setting verses that set the stage for what Luke will go on to record in verses 42 through 52 of this chapter, where after one particular Passover, the boy, Jesus, stayed behind in Jerusalem rather than immediately returning home with his parents and the group they were traveling with. Now, more specifically, what Luke does in verses 42 through 52 is make 3 points about this fact that Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. Point number 1 in verses 42 through 44 is that Jesus was 12 when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. The second point Luke makes in verses 45 through 48 is that Jesus was listening to and asking questions of the teachers when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. And finally, the third point Luke makes in verses 49 through 52 is that Jesus had to be in his Father's house when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. Now, after looking at these things, what we'll learn from these verses is that there will be times when we must stay behind, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But again, this is a longer section we're looking at, so we'll just dive right in, and we'll begin by reading verses 42 through 52. And then we'll look at these points. So again, Luke 2, beginning verse 42, we read, "And when he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning, after spending the full number of days, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But his parents were unaware of it, but supposed him to be in the caravan and went a day's journey, and they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Then, after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When they saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, 'Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you.' And he said to them, "Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand the statement which he had made to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. So again, this is a longer section that we're looking at, but there's 3 points here, and it's all about this idea of Jesus having stayed behind in Jerusalem. First point Luke tells us, that Luke makes, is that Jesus was 12 when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. But this point is introduced with Luke recording verse 42. We find the age of Jesus. He was 12. No discussion necessarily there, but they went up there according to the custom of the feast. That's verse 42. So Luke tells us that he's 12. Is there any significance to that? Yeah, that's actually along the right track. In the male Jewish circumstance in the first century and before, male Jews at the age of 12, that's when they became men. Now let me explain that a little bit. The one reason they became quote-unquote men at that point is because at the age of 12, first century Jewish boys, they were now being expected to learn and to observe Jewish laws. So it's at this point in his life that the boy Jesus was now going to start becoming accountable to the law. So it's for this reason that Luke also emphasizes here that Jesus and his family traveled to Jerusalem as they done before, like we saw in verse 41, according to the custom of the feast. It's just repeating the idea of verse 41, that they did as they always did, in keeping with Jewish law concerning the Passover as it's lined out in passages that I just mentioned already before. One of those is Deuteronomy 16, verses 1 through 6, where you find those requirements. So good answer, Shannon. Hit it right on the head there. Anything else on verse 42? All right. So we go on to verse 43. What happens? Okay, the family leaves, Jesus gets left behind. Now what does this verse say about his parents? They didn't know it. They were unaware of it. So they've spent the whole time in Passover. You'll realize in this story there's nothing there about what happened during the Passover feast. We now move to when the Passover is over here in verse 43. They're going home. Jesus stays behind, and the text says his parents are unaware of it. But the wording that Luke uses here is the full number of days, and that was prescribed by Jewish law. Again, you want to read about that? Deuteronomy 16, verse 3, where we find that the full number of days of the Passover was a total of 7 days. That's when they had to be there. So that time, that 7 days is over, that week, we might say. And the boy, Jesus, would have stayed behind in Jerusalem without his parents being aware of it. That's the text. Now, since that's true, something else we should understand here is that one reason Jesus' parents would not have been aware of his staying behind is because on occasions like the Passover, Jews traveling to and from Jerusalem, they'd be traveling in groups. But something else we need to know about these groups is those groups usually consisted of friends and relatives, people they knew. So this is one reason Jesus' parents would not have been aware, because the whole group is traveling together. Jesus might be with his friends, might be with a relative. They're really not thinking about Jesus' welfare. Now, not in a bad way, they're just assuming he's okay. Now, just let me give you an example of that. Sometimes from my family. Sometimes my family and I, when we go places together, Desiree and I we're not as concerned about our kids when they're not physically with us, because we assume and know that they're with one of our family members when we go places together, so we don't really worry when they're not physically by our side. That's what's happening here. His parents weren't worried about Jesus because they think he's somewhere in the group with one of the friends or the relatives. So that's verse 43. Questions or comments on verse 43? Okay. What I just explained becomes more apparent in verse 44. What does verse 44 tell us? Yep. And how far did they travel? A day's journey. Exactly. That's probably the scenario we're looking at here. So they've gone a day's journey. Let's remember, they're going from Jerusalem all the way up to Nazareth. That's a long way if you're on foot or even with an animal. They didn't have cars, airplanes. They didn't have the nice roads that we have. So they had to stop along the way, a day's journey. They're making camp, and it's at this point that Luke tells us they began looking for him among the relatives and acquaintances, family, friends. So this is what presents the fact that before this point, Jesus' parents assumed he was somewhere in the group. More specifically, it presents the fact that Jesus' parents assumed the boy Jesus was with what we might call family members or friends after they traveled a day's journey. So they make camp. But that's verse 44. Any questions or comments on that? Okay. I know we're moving kind of quickly, so stop me if we're moving too quickly. But putting verses 42 through 44 together, the point we should see about Jesus staying behind in Jerusalem is that Jesus was 12 when this happened. In these verses, Luke has shown that Jesus was the age of 12 when he stayed behind in Jerusalem following the Passover. What Luke has also shown in these verses is that up until Jesus' parents began looking for him, they assumed he was somewhere in the group. As a result, up to this point, the parents were not concerned about the boy Jesus because they believed him to be safe with one of their relatives and acquaintances. That brings us to point number 2, verses 45 to 48. Jesus was listening to and asking questions of the teachers when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. So in verse 45, what happens? They couldn't find him. So what do? They go back to Jerusalem looking for him. Now, just by way of quick review, how far had they traveled before they go back to Jerusalem? 1 day. Let's keep that in mind because that's going to become important here in just a minute. So they go back to Jerusalem looking for him. Now, that's a simple statement, but it's a statement that functions to introduce what Luke will go on to say in verse 46 about how long it took to find him. And so here the point is simply made that upon not finding the boy Jesus, his parents returned to Jerusalem in order to find him, to begin their search. And they're probably looking for him along the way too. They don't wait till Jerusalem to start looking for him. They're looking for him along the way. That parents, put yourself in this circumstance. Looking for your child. You've lost him or her. You're going to look everywhere on the way. Anything else on verse 45? Well, that might be true, but right. Like the parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance. The road to Jericho that's mentioned in that story, it's a pretty notorious road. So crime did happen. What we would construe as crime did happen. But how much crime, I don't know. Anything else on verse 45? Okay. So verse 46, what happens? And what's Jesus doing? So they find him. But again, the first detail Luke presents is after how long? 3 days. Now again, how far had they traveled when they made camp? 1 day. So how long would it take to get back to Jerusalem? Another day. And so now we have 3 days. So what Luke is doing here is accounting for the whole time. It's not 3 days after they arrived in Jerusalem. It's 3 days total. They traveled a day, took a day to come back. That's 2 days. No more than a day after they arrived in Jerusalem that they finally found him. But then Luke tells us what he's doing. He's sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking questions. So what is Jesus doing? Go ahead, Dean, sorry. That's probably true. And hold on to that thought, because we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. So he's listening to and asking questions. The scene here then is one where Jesus is learning. We might be able to suggest there's some teaching going on his part, but we have to remember he's a 12-year-old Jewish boy. He's probably putting himself in a position as a learner as opposed to a teacher. But he is listening to them and asking them questions. So that's how learning took place in the first century Jewish situation. So learning takes place a lot today. This listening and asking questions. But Dean makes a good point. This is probably not where they expected to find Jesus. Again, he's a 12-year-old boy. What are 12-year-old boys normally doing? Playing some kind of ball. They're out there with their friends. So as far as Mary and Joseph are concerned, they've lost Jesus. You might have found a friend in Jerusalem. We're going to look for him everywhere. Dean makes a good point. Temple is probably the last place they went before they finally found Jesus. Well, it is the last place they went because they found him. Yes. So anything else on verse 46? All right. So they find Jesus listening to and asking questions, and there's a lot of people probably there when Mary and Joseph arrive. And so what does Luke tell us in verse 47? That's it. This is the response of the teachers and anybody else who was present when Mary and Joseph arrived. Again, this is a 12-year-old boy. And this is why they're amazed at his understanding and his answers. Now, with that being the case, one thing we should understand here is that one reason this amazement would be taking place is because of what is said in verse 40 of this chapter. Now, let's go back to verse 40. What was happening with Jesus as he continued to grow? And what else? Spawning. So we studied that verse. Jesus was growing. I think Dee made the comment he was not your average child at that point. So Jesus had a wisdom about him that any other 12-year-old boy at the time didn't have. And that's where this amazement is coming from, is he could give answers. He understood things better than any other boy in his position of the time. Absolutely. We can definitely make that assumption because Luke says, and all who heard him. The teachers are included in that, but there could have been others that could have come in and hearing what Jesus had to say and how he was learning. Anything else on verse 47? Sorry, I lost my place. Verse 48. So Mary and Joseph have arrived, and how are they responding to this? They were astonished. What were they astonished at? That might be it. Because they have just arrived. They haven't necessarily heard what's happened before they've arrived. So they're likely just astonished to find Jesus, of all places, in the temple, not out there playing with other Jewish boys. And so what does his mother say? Exactly. She's reacting like any other mother would. I don't know. But yeah, she asked this question, why have you treated us this way? Why did you not come home with us? Or at least start making your way home with us. So the text says, behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you. Yes, as Dina put, she's worried. They're surprised to find Jesus where he is and doing what he's doing. Now, since that's the case, something else we should understand here is that up to this point, Jesus had probably never done this. It was not till he reached the age of 12 that this might have been the first occasion where he stayed behind and didn't go home. And that's part of also where this astonishment is coming from. Because, son, you've never done this before. Why have you treated us in this way? So all those things combined is why we can assume that Mary is reacting like any other mother would. Distress that her child was not in the group when she went to find him for that 3-day period that it took to finally find the boy Jesus. Questions or comments on verse 48? All right. So the point we should see from verses 45 through 48 about Jesus staying behind in Jerusalem is that he was listening to and asking questions when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. Now in these verses, Luke has shown that when Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, he was, as the text said, listening to and asking questions of the teachers that were in the temple in Jerusalem. The response was that they were amazed, and then his parents were astonished at the fact that they found him where he was and doing what he was doing. And so Jesus' mother answered in the way any mother would. Why he did what he did, because his father and mother had been anxiously looking for him. Now that brings us to verses 49 through 52. The third point about him staying behind in Jerusalem, and where we find the first words of Jesus in this section. What does he say in verse 49? And what else does he say? That you have, I must be about my Father's business there. Does anyone else have that? Or do you have Father's house? Father's house, okay. We'll talk about that in a minute. So he asked these two questions. And that's something that become a common feature of Jesus' ministry as an adult, questions. We had a whole class about them not too long ago. So Luke is recording two questions from the boy Jesus. He first asks, why is it that you were looking for me? The point of that question seems to be they should have been known where to find him. But then in the American Standard, did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house? Now that word house, if that's what you have, not in the original language. A better translation is probably had to be about my Father's business. But in the American Standard, the word house is probably put there because of where he was found. The temple, which was known as my kids like to call it, God's house. So, the point of that question is, you should have known where to find me. You should have known where I was, where I had to be. And so Jesus' questions here are questions of surprise, where he's surprised that they were looking for him because they should have known where he was and what he was doing. Especially at the age of 12, because again, at that age, that's when Jewish boys would become accountable to Jewish law. Anything else on verse 49? That might be true because of, what Luke told us in verse 40, that increasing in wisdom. So that might be what Jesus is helping them to understand with these questions, is should have known where to find him. So anything else on verse 49? Okay. So verse 50, what does Luke tell us? They didn't understand what? The statement. The text says the statement which he had made to them. Now, what's a statement? What you say. Something you've said. Well, what didn't they understand? What Jesus said in verse 49. Now, with that in mind, something else we should understand here is that what Luke says here it does not mean that they did not understand the words Jesus said. They understood his words. That's clear. But what this means is that they did not understand the significance of what Jesus said. Because what Jesus said was something that could not be understood by people who were not as far along as Jesus was in their mental and spiritual development. Now again, Luke has already told us in verse 40, he was increasing in wisdom. And that was as a child. We haven't even reached his adult ministry yet. So Jesus was a lot further along than any other boy of his time. And I would go so far as to argue that even at the age of 12, he was so much further along than we are here today. It's for this reason that one commentator says, to this day, the mental and spiritual development of the boy who was the God-man lies beyond our psychology and experience. I know I could never understand how far along Jesus was spiritually, even at the age of 12. Right. Exactly. There was no one like Jesus. There is no one like Jesus. And we see this theme in the Gospels about people recognizing the kind of person Jesus was. John 7, verse 46, people say of Jesus, never has a man spoken the way this man speaks. So what Luke records here in verse 50 means that what the boy Jesus' parents failed to understand was the significance of what Jesus had said to them in those questions that he asked. That's verse 50. Questions or comments on that verse? Okay. So verse 51, what happens next? And what else does the verse say? Treasured up all these things in your heart. So, he goes back with his parents to Nazareth. And the text says, he lived in submission to them. Why? He was a boy and there were his parents, but why else? Okay, that's what that's what normal boys would do, but what'd the law say? Father your mother and father. Be subject to your parents. Jesus was doing what the law required of him. He went back with his parents and lived in submission to them. And then, yes, Luke adds, his mother treasured all these things in her heart. What does that mean? She pondered on him, thought about him. She took them all in. This has already been said once in this chapter. Go back all the way back to verse 19. It says, well, I'll start with verse 18. And all who heard it wondered at the things which were told them by the shepherds. But Mary treasured all these things, pondering them in her heart. Go back to verse 51. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. She is amazed at this son of hers. She's treasuring all that has happened in these last 12 years that Luke has accounted for in just a few verses, these verses that make up chapter 2. Again, as I've already said, we read these verses one to the next, but up to this point, there's 12 years of time that Luke has covered in the span of one chapter. Yeah. That's true. So yeah, it's closer to 13 years. At least. So Mary is treasuring the boy Jesus' awareness of his relationship to God the Father, even at the age of 12. Now, when Jesus said, I had to be in my Father's house or had to be about my Father's business, he's not talking about Joseph. He's talking about God. Anything else on verse 51? So verse 52, we have one final statement about Jesus. What does verse 52 say? Favoring God and men. So this statement about Jesus, it's one that closely resembles what's already been said about him once before. We've already mentioned it several times. Verse 40. Verse 40, Jesus, or Luke calls him the child, continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. But here, it's a similar but slightly different list of characteristics. That he first says he increased in wisdom and stature. Now, increasing in wisdom, what does that mean? Smart. Knowing more about what? Okay, life, but what? God's will. This wisdom idea, it's the wisdom of God. He's becoming more aware of what God expects of him. But now we have stature. What's stature? Physically. This is another statement about his physical aspect. He's growing up. So increasing in wisdom is a spiritual growth and development. Stature has to do with his physical growth and development. And so since Jesus was growing in this way, it's for this reason that Luke also adds that Jesus was growing in favor with God and men. Now we've talked about this word favor. What's another word for it? Grace. This word favor we have right here, it's the grace word. Verse 40 said, the grace of God was upon him. Same word. Luke could have put growing in grace here. But we have favors, how our translators chose to translate it. But not only with God, but also with man. So Luke is making the point that Jesus was being favored by both God and man as he grew spiritually and physically. And this was just within the first 12 years of his life. Questions or comments on verse 52? All right. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 49 through 52 about Jesus staying behind in Jerusalem is that Jesus had to be in his Father's house when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. In these verses, Luke has shown that one reason Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem is because he had to be in his Father's house, the temple. Or he had to be about his Father's business, however you have it. But what Luke has also shown in these verses is that Jesus' earthly parents did not initially understand the significance of Jesus having to be in his Father's house. But even though this is the case, Luke also shows that Jesus did return with his parents to Nazareth, and he lived in obedience to them, and this is something else that Mary treasured in her heart. The end result of these things, according to Luke, is that Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. So when we consider everything that Luke has recorded in verses 41 through 52 of this chapter in Luke, the point we should be left with is that Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. He was 12 when this happened. He was listening to and asking questions when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. And finally, he had to be in his Father's house when he stayed behind in Jerusalem. Again, in application, for us, there are times we must also stay behind. I'll explain that. Now, as we've seen in these verses, Luke has told a story about when the boy Jesus stayed behind rather than going with the rest of the group he and his family were with. Since that's true, one application of these verses to us is that there will be those occasions when we have to stay behind and allow a group to go without us. One reason we might have to do this is so that we can continue to learn from those who are teaching us. Another reason we might have to do this based on these verses is so that we can more effectively do the Lord's work. Whatever the circumstance, there will be those times when the Lord calls us to stay behind rather than go with the rest of the group to wherever they might be going. I hope that makes sense. Any other questions or comments? All right. I've seen some of you yawning. Dean, will you close us with a prayer?